Hi, welcome back. This is 8.2, Human Impacts on Aquatic Ecosystems. So our learning objectives for today are to describe the impacts of human activities on aquatic ecosystems. So the first one we're going to look at is coral reefs. So coral reefs, we know, have a high amount of biodiversity. They are one of the most biodiverse aquatic ecosystems, and one thing that makes them really special is the types of animals that live there, namely coral. Coral lives very symbiotically with algae. The algae feeds itself by photosynthesis, and in turn the coral reef then feeds on the algae. So that's really the crux of that ecosystem, and it's what we're largely trying to protect. The corals themselves are really sensitive, and that's often what gets damaged when humans are polluting or interacting with those environments or are threatening them in some way. So what do those threats look like? We've already talked about one of them when we were talking about fishing, but bottom trawling, when you're scraping nets along the bottom of the ocean floor, depending on where you're trawling, you could potentially be trawling over coral reefs, and that could be damaging to them. Other things like marine debris, this could be nets, traps, fishing line, any of that gets wrapped around or intertwined with the coral reefs could also damage them. And of course, all of this damage to the reef is going to cause a loss of biodiversity to other species who are dependent on the coral for their home. Overfishing, so it's really common for people to want to hunt or fish near coral reefs because there's a lot of unique fish there. A lot of actually what gets taken from there are tropical fish that get put into the tropical fish trade or the exotic animal trade for people to buy like at pet stores or to have in their home tanks. So potentially overfishing in that area could be problematic. And then the last one is something called cyanide fishing, which is maybe one of the newer ideas. Sodium cyanide is poured over a coral reef or in an area where a reef is to try to stun the fish temporarily fast enough for people to catch them. Again, this is used frequently with exotic fish trade or the pet industry for exotic fish, and possibly even restaurants if they're trying to fish for or have exotic fish on their menu. The sodium cyanide doesn't kill the fish, it temporarily stuns them, but is super problematic for corals and will kill them. There's also, again, the threat to sedimentation. We just learned about sedimentation in 8.1, but that's particulates of soil, rock, and clay. If there's a lot of sedimentation near a coral reef, it's going to deflect how much sunlight actually makes its way down to the coral reef, so it will affect how much photosynthesis is occurring or how much that algae can then photosynthesize, which the coral reef, the coral depends on the algae, so potentially it could decrease the amount of sunlight that's entering in that area. And then the last threat to coral reefs is going to be rising ocean temperatures. So we'll talk a lot about what's killing corals in a little bit later in our ocean acidification unit, but right now we're going to focus just on ocean temperatures. So healthy coral depend on algae to survive. What happens though when ocean temperatures rise is that algae doesn't like that shift in temperature. It's outside of their range of tolerance. It makes them uncomfortable, so they'll leave the coral to try to find cooler temperatures. As soon as the algae leaves the coral, though, the coral no longer has anything to feed on. So it'll start to turn this very white, non-pigmented color. We call that bleached coral or coral bleaching. The coral isn't necessarily dead at this point, but it's very vulnerable, so it's more likely to break or be broken. And then, of course, if the algae doesn't return over long periods of time, then, of course, the coral will eventually die. Okay, we're shifting away from coral reefs and we're really going to focus on eutrophication and why dissolved oxygen in water is so important and how we measure dissolved oxygen. So DO, or dissolved oxygen, is often referred to as DO, and it's just a measure of how much oxygen is available in the water. We care about how much oxygen is in the water because aquatic species, even though they live underwater, still require oxygen. Most aquatic species have a way of breathing in oxygen underwater, either through gills or some other way. And so they do require that there be some oxygen present in the water. But as we know, increased amounts of eutrophication can cause lower amounts of dissolved oxygen in the water as a result of increased microbial activity. And so we're going to kind of look at how that actually plays out. We're going to do a deep dive on eutrophication. So another term you need to be familiar with, which is different than DO, is BOD, or biological oxygen demand. This is the amount of oxygen that is required for species living in that area, or how much is needed for species in that area. And so usually if there's a high demand for oxygen, a high biological oxygen demand, that's generally associated with higher levels of pollution. So if there's a higher level of pollution, there's going to be less oxygen present, so the demand is going to be very high. Whereas if there's a lower demand, that probably means the water is less polluted, so there's probably a surplus of oxygen available to species in the water, so the demand is going to be much lower. And we'll talk about what causes or what drives those higher demands and why oxygen decreases. A lot of it has to do with microbial activity. When there's more, so when we talk about eutrophication, when there's more phosphates or nitrates in the water, it causes more algae to want to grow. As that algae dies and after it feeds on all of the nitrates and phosphates, and it's not surviving anymore because there's no nutrients left, it starts to decompose. Microbes will come in to feed on that algae, and as they break down that algae and feed on it, they require oxygen. So the decomposition of that algae within the microbes requires oxygen. So the more pollution there is, the more microbial activity there is, the more oxygen those microbes are going to be taking in, and the less there's going to be available for the species actually living there. So the demand will be very high. Whereas a low BOD would be the opposite. There isn't a lot of microbial activity. So the demand for oxygen the demand for oxygen of species living in the water is going to be much less because there's more available. So what does this actually look like? We call this an oxygen sag curve, and that's what you're seeing with this blue line here. So the first one is going to be, we're looking at a point source pollutant, just so that we can go back and look at some terminology that we're familiar with. So let's say that this is sewage runoff, could be CAFO runoff, whatever it is, it's ending up in the water. Okay, so that's what we're going to be focusing on. It's causing some type of pollution into this river. Now, prior to the pollution, upstream in this clean zone, we've got normal clean water. We've got a significant amount of species diversity or biodiversity here. Our dissolved oxygen level is high and our demand is low. There's a surplus of oxygen available to all of the species living here, so the demand for oxygen is very low. As soon as the pollution enters in, we start to see the amount of dissolved oxygen decrease because microbial activity has increased. As a result, the demand for oxygen greatly increases because there is less available. But you can see, and it slowly starts to decrease, meaning our demand will slowly become less as we get away from the pollution. So as we move further downstream, where less pollution is affecting the water, we start to see our oxygen levels, our dissolved oxygen levels increase and our demand go back to normal. So downstream, there's less pollution. Upstream, there's less pollution, but in the area where pollution exists, our dissolved oxygen levels fall and our demand then increases. This portion that you're looking at right here, this is the actual oxygen sag curve. This is the sag portion of the curve, and the sag portion is being caused by increased microbial activity in water. So this is kind of the deeper dive or deeper look into what eutrophication is actually causing. Now we'll go over this quickly because we already kind of talked about oil spills, but of course oil spills have an effect on aquatic ecosystems. We focused on two in particular, Exxon Valdez and Deepwater Horizon, which were both pretty bad. And of course those oil spills had long-lasting impacts on wildlife, food chain, and coastal economies. And a lot of that had to do with how the oil was interacting with those species. So we know that oil tends to float on the surface of water. It can coat the feathers of birds, which means they can't regulate temperature. They can't fly, which means they can't feed themselves. So that food chain gets disrupted. Population may increase. It may decrease large amounts of certain species that are consuming a lot of the hydrocarbon, and there's no food source left for other species that like to come in. So a disruption to the food chain. We also see a disruption to the fur of marine mammal species like sea otters. If they become coated with oil, it makes them no longer waterproof, which makes it harder for them to swim, harder for them to maintain their body temperature. And then, of course, anything that's ingesting a hydrocarbon like oil or fuel, that is toxic to most living things, and they will not survive. And so this is just a further dive on how food chains can be affected. Some components of oil will sink to the ocean floor. If those oil blobs stay at the bottom for a long time and they're not broken up by a wave or wind action on the surface, organisms living at the bottom are at risk of dying if they're ingesting a lot of that oil, which sometimes we intentionally sink oil to the bottom of the water. So sometimes species that are living near the bottom can be disproportionately affected if that's the type of choice we use for oil cleanup. Okay, and then sedimentation, of course, we're back to this. This is a big problem, but here's a deeper look at what the issues are with sedimentation. So sediments are particles of soil, sand, and clay, and we know that these can enter into waterways through erosion, like wind erosion, soil erosion, potentially an unconfined construction site, and really that's going to change the level of clarity in the water, or the turbidity. Turbidity measures cloudiness, so you can see like in this water, the water is really cloudy. You can't see through it. Now, the effects of this, obviously, this is going to shift how much how much sunlight penetrates through these layers, so less photosynthesis is going to be occurring. That also means there's potentially less dissolved oxygen, because we know photosynthesizers' byproduct is oxygen, so potentially dissolved oxygen levels in the water are also going to decrease. It also changes the vision of some aquatic species. So if species need to be able to see in clear water to see their predators or their prey, this could disrupt that and in turn disrupt food webs. And then, of course, if there's a lot of loose sediments and those sediments are getting lodged in the gills of fish, it could potentially disrupt their ability to exchange oxygen and water. Okay, another type of pollution is heavy metals in drinking water. So the ones that we'll kind of focus on are lead, mercury, arsenic, copper, cadmium, and chromium, and we'll be expanding on these a little bit later. These can end up in waterways in a multitude of ways. We know acid mine drainage contains things like arsenic, contains things like copper, smelting or extracting / melting of metals that can have things like lead, copper, arsenic. Wastewater can contain any of these depending on where it's coming from. Mercury is used in almost every industrial process, which is why we're always so worried about mercury levels in water. And then, of course, fossil fuel combustion can lead to mercury and arsenic being exposed to water as well. And of course, there's some pretty dangerous health effects here: cancer, organ damage, neurological issues, if this is water that you will be consuming at any point. One of the ones that you're probably more familiar with is mercury poisoning. And just to be clear, mercury poisoning doesn't come from elemental mercury. That's mercury on the periodic table mercury. It comes from something called methyl mercury. Methyl mercury is mercury, elemental mercury, that has been converted by bacteria into an organic form of mercury called methyl mercury. And this is the one that is toxic to humans. This is the one that if you're consuming like a lot of salmon or tuna, top predators, you're consuming a lot of methyl mercury. This bioaccumulates in ecosystems. It bioaccumulates in species. So if you consume a top predator, you're consuming high levels of methyl, possibly high levels of methyl mercury. And really what you're largely concerned with here is neurological damage and possibly birth defects if you have a fetus or are a young child, infant. If you want to hear more about like extreme cases of methylmercury poisoning. We might talk about this in class, but Minamata, Japan is famous for Minamata disease, which is extreme methylmercury poisoning. And this was a bunch of mercury getting dumped into a local drinking water source from a chemical supply company. And all of the locals in this area ended up incredibly ill for decades. We might talk about this one in class. It's pretty interesting, but if you want to watch the YouTube video. And this is our last slide here, solid waste in aquatic ecosystems. You're probably most familiar with this one, plastics in the ocean or trash that ends up in the ocean. I think most of us are aware that the biggest problem here is, of course, sea animals feeding on this, thinking it's food, and in turn not being able to survive the digestion of those products. Or you've probably all seen the images of the sea turtle with plastic wrapped around its neck, not being able to feed itself, etc. So that's super that can be super tragic. And then of course we have the disruption of light entering into water. So like if we're talking about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, where a large portion of the ocean is covered by trash, that's going to lead to large dead zones from lack of photosynthesis because light can't filter down. And then lastly is microplastics. Really, we're concerned about these tiny plastic pieces because a lot of times they're what contribute to the release of endocrine disruptor chemicals like BPA. A lot of plastics now are BPA free if there's something that you're consuming, but if you're not actually consuming anything out of it, a lot of plastics still contain BPA. And we'll talk more about like what BPA is exactly and how it's an endocrine disruptor. But chemicals will cling to these tiny particles, and those BPAs can then be consumed by aquatic life or plankton or other organisms, and of course that can be a disruption to their health. Okay, I think that's it. We'll start on 8.3 next, and I'll see you soon. Thanks.